Welcome to Toronto Speaks Addiction. I'm your host, Dr. Vera Tarman. Tonight we're discussing addiction in the gay and lesbian, bi and trans communities. What types of drug use are specific to this community? Are there unique behaviors that are particularly worrisome? What are some of the treatment obstacles that might stop someone from getting help? Can we change these to be more accommodating? I have the pleasure of welcoming a seasoned clinician in the field, Dr. Jim Cullen. He is a registered social worker who has worked in the LGBTQ community as a mental health and addiction care specialist for over 20 years. We are also joined by Nicki Ward, a prominent trans activist who has had to navigate the treatment world that has not been trans. Nicki, do you want to add something to that specific thing, different trends, maybe in the trans population or?
Well, I mean, the first thing, just to circle the wagons back a little bit, is that any of the data that's collected that's gender oriented it becomes very difficult to track in the trans community. And so, for example, as Jim was saying about drug use amongst men and trans folk, well, there are some trans folk who also identify as men, and there are trans folk who also identify as women. And so that becomes very, very tricky to actually get the data, tease out the data. I think one of the things that Jim mentioned also is the social climate has a great deal to do with it, and I think also adversity that is faced in a social context. So, right now, I mean, you mentioned about it's legal for gay people to get married in Canada. However, at the federal level, there is still no protection for trans people. Yep. So it is still at the federal level legal to fire them merely for being trans, to deny them transportation, housing, education, and employment. These are very, very, very serious issues that put trans people at a disadvantage against the rest of the population. And so understandably, this population turns to other means to actually cope with the business of just trying to get by.
I would imagine too that that would be really a reason to not seek treatment, because you have to then declare yourself, and then you have all these potential legal ramifications.
Well, exactly right. I mean, there's the double stigma. I'm personally out and proud as a trans woman, and proud of having long-term recovery. But regrettably, I'm a rare beast. Coming out in these studies that report how many people are actually misusing or abusing drugs and alcohol require, in the case of trans people, double disclosure. Number one, the disclosure that they recognize an issue in themselves, and number two, that they have this gender variance of some kind. And in fact, if you come out as having an addiction problem at work, you may well actually get help. However, if you come out as being trans at work, you may actually get fired. And so getting accurate data is going to be close to impossible.
Okay. Really? Yeah. Wow. Okay. Now, I'm just going to shift it over to you, Nicki. Do you want to, what are you willing to share about your story?
Oh, anything that helps. I'd just like to, again, circle back on a number of things that Jim brought up, is that there's a high degree of self-selection, as you've admitted, in your practice. The ability to pay, and a higher degree of sense of agency and, frankly, entitlement. Many of the things you're describing seem, based on my lived experience, and I directly interact with a number of trans people. I always think trans folks sound slightly Lord of the Rings, don't you?
That's very funny.
The real life lived experience.
You may not know this, but Nicki is a comedian.
Well, you would never know it. Dry. Certainly have a dark sense of humor. I mean, the truth of the matter is that you don't survive long as a trans person, period, and you don't survive long unless you develop a dark sense of humor and an ability to roll with the tremendous, the industrial amounts of tragedy that one encounters on a regular basis. The number one consideration for those who are active in their use, who are members of the trans community, is price and availability. And so whatever is cheap, whatever happens to be on hand, that may be crystal meth, but it may be.
You're talking about the drug use, not the recovery, the drug use at this point.
Yeah, drug and alcohol use. Yeah, it's about what is available, what is cheap, and sometimes, what is provided to them as an inducement to do business. The reality is that unemployment rates amongst trans women, particularly, is absurd. I mean, it's running at 67%. Suicidal ideation and activation is again very, very, very high. So many of these, as bizarre as it may sound, crystal meth almost, and I'm not diminishing this, almost sounds like a first world problem when you deal with the realities of lack of housing, education. And as you rightly say, there's a term, I don't know if you've heard of this, it's called trans broken arm syndrome.
I've not heard of it. Explain that.
Well, it's when a trans person goes to see a doctor and says, well, I have a broken arm, and the doctor says, well, I know nothing about trans issues. I can't possibly help you.
Yes.
Yeah, the barriers to getting good quality help as a type you provide are massive. That said, for those who do seek recovery, and my exposure has been through 12-step programs, not by choice, but by expedience. To my knowledge, there are no detox centres in Canada, and certainly not in Ontario, that are trained in how to deal with trans people. And so I actually when I went through the DTs, we were talking about this, the DTs from some of these opiates are awful, and you feel like you're going to die. But when you're coming off alcohol, you actually can. And I was presented with the choice of going through DTs at home or admitting myself into a hospital and being hospitalized, in this case, as a male. And I chose to detoxify on my own and at my home, and it was a horrific 3 days of, classic, it was dreadful. And so, indeed, so detox centers, treatment centers, people with the kind of expertise describing, drug therapy was simply not available, and frankly, it's still not available. So, what you're describing sounds very encouraging about drug treatment, but it's simply, not available.
It's availability. And the thing that's frustrating as well is it's actually a great time to work in the mental health and addiction field. We have treatments.
Business is good. It's not solid.
A great history with the LGBTQ community, but individually, the counselors and the actual homes that I work with have actually been quite open to having trans people come in. So I guess my question is, in the last year or 2 or 3, where there's been so much more public awareness, my impression is that things are actually opening up and changing. But what's your experience in the sort of in the trenches, as it were? I mean, yourself as a...
I have to think about that. That's a very difficult question to answer, because the death rate appears to be steadying, but it is still the question of, for example, every Pride we have coming up. We have the Trans Day of Remembrance, and as I was saying to Jim earlier, the coincidence of drug and alcohol with the untimely death of trans people is at or near 100%. It's not to say that it's a causal relationship, but the fact is that drugs and alcohol are almost invariably linked with the premature death of trans people. And the upper median age is 47, I think, for a trans woman. So the prognosis is not great. And so it's very difficult to hear people say it's getting better when the evidence that there is A, very little data because it's difficult to collect, and B, my first-hand experience is that people are still dying.
So a member living in the community, it's actually, you don't actually see much difference at this stage.
There is, to my knowledge, I very rarely do people lift them. Seeking recovery begins with having some degree of hope that you can actually find recovery and better life afterwards.
Exactly.
And without that platform of hope, there's no springboard to go onward.
So they're not even getting to that stage.
They don't get through that first hoop. And if they did, where are they going to go to actually get? It seems for those of us who are consumers of healthcare, even in this neck of the wood where people are a little more ahead of the curve, still every time I go to the doctor, where I don't see my regular GP, I feel like a lab rat, where I'm engaging in remedial education, with this trans broken arm syndrome.
Yes.
And I've taken some trans people to even very good, try to get them through into a detox center, and basically had to stand there and engage in workshopping the counselors even as the person is trying to get sober. And in that environment where trust is key, trust and a sense of that the other person understands your point of view, I have not seen, I'm trying to think if I have seen one successful graduate. I can't think of one. I have seen some people, there is some good work going on in peer-to-peer support networks right now in Toronto that is at least promising, if not, make one burst out into song. But there is. Yeah.
And to be able to
Meaning physicians like myself who, I mean, I'm sure I say stupid things, maybe not the broken arm syndrome, but without not even knowing. Yeah. And earlier we were talking about how you had at Sherbourne Health Centre the first experience of actually having doctors listen.
It was a great opportunity, and that really was actually well said. A definite step forward in the movement of better health care for trans people, at least in Toronto. Sherbourne Health Centre did an amazing thing, which was get a bunch of trans people. And at the time there was a question as to whether we even existed. Get us in a room with a bunch of physicians, and instead of and explain, the realities. Back then, they would not prescribe. Back then, the whole gender identity thing was just so messed up. You couldn't get treatment if you were HIV positive. You couldn't get treatment if you had another mental health issue, and you certainly couldn't if you were identified as an addict. So it was problematic. But we sat down with them and said, look, we exist and we deserve health care. And we designed an intake protocol at the Sherbourne Health Centre that is, I think, still being used as a model. But yeah.
Wow, that's very interesting. Anything else to add about? I mean, I'm interested in what can we do looking forward to make things more inclusive, helpful.
Enough on that, if I may. That my own experience of LGBT 12-step programs has been almost uniformly positive. Paradoxically, the situation that trans people find themselves in today is very similar to the nascent days of AA back in the 30s, where you were stigmatized, set aside from society. For all its faults, and they are many, 12-step programs are free, broadly available, require that you believe nothing. You don't need any income, which is handy because trans people don't have it. And certainly in Toronto, a very vibrant LGBT community. And if you don't find a connection with a found family there are enough other meetings that you can at least find some sense that you are not completely isolated.
It's about...
Take the last 20 seconds or so.
I'll take 20 minutes for sure, but I'll take 20 seconds. Okay. I think the most important thing is to communicate that there is hope, that recovery can be found, and to try and model good behavior. That's it, is that you're not alone, and there is hope. It's going to take work, but you can recover.
Okay, well, I want to thank both of you for spending time to speak, and as a clinician, I'm really happy to hear that there are other alternatives, especially 12-step, because you're right, not everybody wants that. So that is all the time we have today, and I'd like to give a special thanks to Dr. Jim Cullen and Nicki Ward for helping us understand some of the addiction and recovery issues pertinent to the LGBTQ communities. Perhaps this knowledge may encourage you or someone you know to seek help. Remember, although the system has not been historically kind to the LGBTQ communities, conversations like this one today can make a difference. We are changing attitudes, one clinician and one patient at a time. We are listening. I'm your host, Dr. Vera Tarman, and thanks for watching Toronto Speaks Addiction.